And you can go, Carla.
Okay. First of all, I'm honored to be on the territory of the Comox First Nation. My name is Carla Neal. I use the she, her pronouns. And this is the second election that I've run for the Marxist-Leninist Party. This election was not a good time to call an election. Aside from the fact that it was unnecessary, it was also dangerous because Trudeau knew before we entered the fourth wave, before he called the election, that we were already in the fourth wave. It's just one example of how the government we have is currently unaccountable to the people. Remember Trudeau's promise 2 elections ago now, that one would be the last first past the post election. Remember his promise to end boil water advisories on reserves. And he's not alone in making promises that are simply going to be broken after it's elected. We have a problem with the process. The electoral process should be funded, not the individual, not the parties. The candidate should be chosen by the people and not by the parties. Right now, candidates are selected by parties and approved by their leadership. So what happens is that parties get elected instead of people. Accountability runs in only one direction, from them to us. Communication is from them to us. They tell us what we're supposed to do. We need an economy and a political process that serves the people and not the global cartels that it currently does. The main thing we need in this riding and in Canada is democratic renewal. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jennifer Grenz from the Liberal Party, you're next, please.
Hello, my name is Dr. Jennifer Grenz, and I am your Liberal Party of Canada candidate. I am a proud Inkapamik woman with mixed ancestry. My family comes from the Lytton First Nation, though I am known as one of the coastal cousins. I have a Bachelor of Science in Agroecology and have been working in ecological restoration and invasive species management for environmental nonprofits and my own land healing company for almost 20 years. That work has been knee-deep in the mud, pulling weeds, planting native plants, and conducting research. It's been in front of the camera as a media spokesperson on invasive species issues and as a bridge builder, bringing unsuspecting allies together, united by our common values to find solutions to complex environmental issues. During my career, I felt as though many of our attempts to heal our lands and waters weren't working. And I realized that an Indigenous worldview had a lot to offer our approaches to addressing complex topics like climate change and ecology. So as a mom of 3, I went back to UBC where I completed my PhD in integrated studies in land and food systems, where I also teach and taught there for the first time in person in 18 months. My work brings the old and new ways together to lead us toward ecological reconciliation. And I'm running because my extensive work across the riding has shown me that having a member of the opposition representing you and all the things that you care about isn't cutting it. We need a seat at the table in Ottawa. The issues of this riding, climate change, careers, housing, salmon, are too dire to wait another term. Progressive voters have an opportunity to walk the talk on reconciliation and get an Indigenous scholar to represent them in Ottawa. Someone who can help build the big ideas into the programs and policies that we need to have the thriving and resilient communities that we deserve.
Fantastic, thank you. Jessica Wang, candidate for the Green Party, is next.
Thank you, Carissa. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you so much to the NISU for organizing this conversation. My name is Jessica Wegg, and I'm the Green Party candidate for our riding. And I would first like to acknowledge that I am live, work, and play on the traditional lands of the Pentlatch, Iksan, and Comox peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue today. I've got to tell you, I am so excited to be here and for this conversation in particular. There is a lot on the line with this election, whether you like that it was called or not. Here we are. And it's the young people like you and kids younger than you who this is going to matter the most for. So I'll just start by telling you a little bit about myself. I know we're going to get into some of the bigger issues. I am a human rights lawyer, and I've spent the last decade or so of my practice advocating for the rights of sexual abuse victims and for prisoners, as well as police brutality cases. I love my work, but it's problem solving one person at a time. And I knew I could do more, and I wanted to problem solve on a bigger scale. And if we've got a big scale problem going on, it's climate change. It's affecting everyone around the globe. We cannot avoid it. We've got extreme weather events happening all over the place, and we've got to get together and figure out a way to address these problems. I am so happy to be running for the Greens because we've got the biggest, boldest ideas of how we're going to tackle these. And those are the only ways that we're going to get through this. I know that in Ottawa, I will not be led by any private interests or any private companies. As a Green, I'm not whipped, and I'm going to represent the people who have elected me. My constituents and my conscience are the things that will help me be a good parliamentarian and a good MP for the people in this riding. So I am so excited to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Next, we'll hear from Rachel Blaney, candidate for the New Democratic Party.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming out and participating. I want to thank the North Island Student Union so much for putting this forward. And of course, I want to acknowledge that I'm in Powell River, which is a territory where the Weewakai, Weewakam, and Hamathko First Nations live and have a long history. I have been your member of parliament for the last several years. And when I was re-elected in 2019, I never expected that an international pandemic would occur and change the very foundation of all of our lives. From the start, I really focused on people. I'm proud of the work that we did. For example, all night in Parliament at the first sitting of the House of Commons during the pandemic, where I was able to push the government to increase CERB from $1,000 to $2,000, and we were able to push the Liberals to increase their planned wage subsidy from 10% to 75%, a program that has helped so many small businesses in our riding. And as I said to the government again and again, if we don't keep our small businesses, how will we rebuild when the pandemic is over? We were also able, of course, to push the government to make sure that students were actually able to access this program CERB, which was a challenge in the beginning. I have served in my role as the NDP spokesperson on veterans, helping veterans across Canada access the services that they desperately need. And in the first 2 years of being elected, I oversaw more federal dollars into this riding than the previous MP who was a member of cabinet saw in 9 years. Federal resources are coming into our riding, and the most recent one is the announcement that the BC Economic Development Branch of Canada will be placed in Powell River. This is a project that I led, and I'm so grateful to the hundreds of people in the riding that wrote to the minister, encouraging her to make sure that this economic development branch was located in one of these small rural communities, as is so desperately needed. I look forward to continuing this work for you all, and I thank you again for being here tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. We're going to move on to our first question. The first answer, it will be from Jennifer. Number one, currently, North Island Students Union is providing extended health and medical services to members for less than $23 a month. Do you have plans to expand healthcare to include pharmacare, counseling, and other paramedical services, such as physiotherapy?
Well, healthcare needs to be holistic. My own teachings make that clear. Mind, body, spirit have to be taken care of to be centered and to be well. I think that we are fortunate to have a government that has recognized that, especially for our young people who want integrated approaches to their care and wellness. There should not be an additional price for that. In terms of pharmacare, no student should have to choose between paying for prescriptions and putting their food on the table. That's why I'm running for a party that's committed to working collaboratively with the provinces to develop a national universal pharmacare program. So far, only PEI has signed an agreement with our government to implement a universal pharmacare program, and we need the BC NDP and John Horgan to sit down with the federal government and work out a deal, just like we did for childcare. Since 2017, our government has invested $5 billion to the provinces and territories to increase the availability of mental health care. And if elected, an initial investment of $4.5 billion over 5 years to support mental health services, including further investments that support Indigenous peoples. I know firsthand that student access to healthcare and mental health services is vital. I have helped find services for many of my students, especially during the pandemic. It's why I was so happy to see that a re-elected Liberal government will also introduce a new fund for student well-being to improve wait times and increase access to mental health care at colleges and universities. The fund will support the hiring of up to 1,200 new mental health care counselors, including those who can support the needs of BIPOC students and post-secondary institutions across Canada. They'll invest $500 million over 4 years and dedicate 10% annually to support Indigenous governed and operated post-secondary institutions as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's hear from Jessica, please.
So the short answer is yes, the Greens do have a plan to get universal pharmacare and universal dental to everyone in Canada. You've got enough to worry about as students when you're in school without adding the extra burden of wondering whether you can afford the healthcare that you need. And I know that as you're out on your own sometimes or learning things, just, you know, there's a lot on your plate and you need to just have a safe place to go. So it's wonderful that the Students' Union is providing such affordable extended health and medical care to its members, but it should not be incumbent upon organizations like this one to be shouldering that burden alone. The federal government can and should be doing more to prioritize the healthcare and well-being of Canadians and residents. And we would expand the current system in place to, like I said, include universal pharmacare and dental care. With regard to mental health care, we would actually establish a national mental health strategy and suicide prevention strategy and call for the inclusion of mental health services as medically necessary. So they would be included in healthcare. We would also abolish post-secondary education tuition and implement a guaranteed livable income, both of which would help students not only afford the supplemental care that they need, but alleviate a lot of the stress that goes along with post-secondary education. Needing to know whether you can afford the education and rent and healthcare shouldn't be a question. You should be able to have your education and your healthcare and your house over your head. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Rachel?
Well, thank you for this really important question. And I just want to acknowledge the hard work that you're doing to provide such a basic service that so many people go without across our country. The truth is, in Canada, we are the only country that has a universal Medicare system that does not have a pharmacare system. And across the planet, we pay the third highest rates for our medication. And I really think that this is important because whether you're a student, whether you're parents with a young person who has serious health issues, or whether you're a senior, we are just seeing so many people who are cutting medication in half, not able to afford the medication that they desperately need, in and out of the hospital, trying to get that baseline of good health, and they just can't afford the medication, and that's absolutely wrong. The NDP is absolutely committed. Of course, you know, it was Tommy Douglas that brought forward Medicare in Saskatchewan and eventually was able to work at a federal level to make it come to fruition across Canada. We absolutely believe in this. And not only that, we brought forward a piece of legislation, the NDP that was a framework that was really built on the amazing work of Dr. Hoskins, who provided the report to all Canadians and to the Liberal government about what a national pharmacare program should look like. Unfortunately, the Liberals keep saying that it didn't consider the work with the provinces, but absolutely it does. But we know that right now, provinces are all buying their medication individually, so we don't even have that collective framework of purchasing. As for mental health, I agree this is really important. And I think COVID really unpeeled how many challenges so many of us face with mental health. So the NDP believes this, and it will be it's in our platform to make sure that there's more resources from the federal government going to the provincial government to make sure that those services are there and that they're accessible to all folks. The other part I just wanted to mention briefly is that we are committed to making sure that there's a national dental care program. This is something I've heard so much from constituents about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Carla? You'll have to unmute yourself, please, Carla.
Yes, there we go. Sorry. First of all, we have to look at healthcare as a human right. Everybody is entitled to healthcare, and that includes all kinds of healthcare. I've been unfortunate enough over the past decade and a half to deal with all kinds of different aspects of the healthcare system. Some have been good to me, some not so much. But I want to give a shout out to the nursing students at the North Island College who I've had the pleasure of meeting in some of my hospital stays. We can't leave it up to the cartel parties to solve the problems we have in healthcare. They've had their chances, they didn't. The privatization has gone up, and with it, the healthcare costs have gone up. For example, the Comox Valley Hospital was financed supposedly by a cartel that borrowed the money to build it. They leased it back to us. By the time it's paid off after 30 years, we will be the ones that paid for it, and we will own none of it. Of course, medical services have to be fully funded. A healthy population is not only more productive, but happier. We need to ban for-profit corporations in healthcare. We need people involved in healthcare, not foreign corporations. Empty beds are of no use if there aren't the funds to staff them. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I would like to just pause here for a moment and have everybody look at their camera so I can take a nice little screenshot and commemorate tonight's time. So get a big smile from everyone who's participating, and I really appreciate you being here tonight. Awesome, thank you so much. Moving on to question 2. In light of the climate crisis, how will our riding, our region, and Canada as a whole transition our economy from traditional resource extraction to sustainable work practices? Jessica, can you please start us?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for this question. I love that this question is how do we transition our economy, not whether we need to do it. I don't have to tell you the climate crisis is dire, and this election, whether you agree with it being called or not, we're still in the throes of a pandemic, matters for that reason. The Green Party has the boldest vision for tackling this problem. We are not aiming for mediocrity. We're not having a plan with giant holes and gaps where we know they should be filled. We do not have time for that. We need to achieve net zero as quickly as possible, and we are aiming to achieve net negative by 2050. We have no choice but to get off fossil fuels as quickly as possible in order to avoid a catastrophic rise in temperature. We start immediately by canceling all new pipeline projects, starting with TMX, canceling all new oil exploration projects, banning fracking, and ending all subsidies to fossil fuel companies, which add up to about $18 billion annually. And I know that this sounds like a lot of canceling and a lot of closing of opportunities, but I'm actually really excited about all of the opportunities in new, green, and sustainable industries that we can step into. We do not need to dread our future. By taking bold and decisive action now, we can transform our futures and put Canada at the forefront of environmental progress globally. Greens would introduce a Just Transition Act before the end of 2021 that takes care of workers and communities during the transition. So let's take logging, for example. We're not just saying no more logging. We're saying that we need to change the way we log to be more sustainable. In fact, we would fund new and innovative forestry-based manufacturing facilities to create jobs and keep profits from our resources in Canada. There's so much room for growth and opportunity here, and we need to embrace it and move forward through together. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Rachel?
Well, thank you for this question. I think it's incredibly important, and it's one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So much so that I actually brought forward a motion in the House. It's motion 53. You can Google motion 53 and Rachel Blaney, and you can read through it if you're really interested. But this is a motion called Principles for Sustainable and Equitable Future. And what it really talked about is when we're recovering from COVID, how are we going to do this in a fair way and an equitable way and make sure that the future that we're looking towards is more sustainable in terms of the environment? It focuses on rural and remote communities. Our communities are often resource-based communities that are in a place of transition right now. We see it every day, and we don't have the supports and resources to actually look at how are we going to take the next step. So my plan really includes working with Indigenous communities, UNDRIP, making sure that's fully implemented, seeing equitable funding go to ridings across Canada, not leaving out rural and remote communities, acknowledging the real impacts of climate change and how they impact our individual regions, and looking at those local realities and supporting the diversifying and increasing of our local green jobs by focusing on the knowledge of the people here and of the workers here. You know, one of the things that the NDP has committed to is ending key factors like ending fossil fuel subsidies. In 2020 alone, $18 billion went in that way. So if we look at how we're going to move forward and invest in the green economy, that is one way, and there are many others that we can actually take cash out of what's happening that isn't benefiting us and looking at how we can invest it in a meaningful way in communities like ours. I'm also really proud of the work that the NDP did on the Climate Accountability Act in the last parliament. We pushed really hard. You know, we had a Liberal government that was saying our accountability will be in 2050. We brought it down to 2030, made sure the panel was more independent, and made sure to acknowledge First Nations knowledge and wisdom. I think those are the key things that I can show as examples of our work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. Carla?
Is that okay? Am I on? I'm not, oh shoot. Why isn't that? I think I did something wrong.
We can hear you.
No, I just shut off the video. There. Okay, I think I'm okay. I'm sorry. I'm not very competent with that stuff. Addressing the climate crisis means first and foremost requiring a new relationship with Indigenous First Nations, which requires their consent for any development on unceded territories. Currently, most of the resource extraction in British Columbia is foreign capital, and the profits from our resources go straight out of the country. We need to stop logging old growth. We need to ban raw log exports, and we need to ban fish farms, which are primarily Norwegian owned and have no duty to Canadians, to our environment, or to our values. We need an anti-war government because the military is one of the largest emitters of carbon and none of it is counted. We need to make working in the resource industry safe by listening to the workers. They know how to make their working conditions safe and they should be listened to. Right now, resource extraction has one of the highest on-the-job death and injury rates of any profession. We need a self-reliant economy that serves the people and not foreign corporations. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. Jennifer?
Well, as someone who works on the ground on ecological restoration and salmon habitat restoration, I think it's really important that we not misjudge the very industries that gave rise to the many towns of our riding and continue to employ members of our families and provide a lot of work-learn opportunities, especially for my own students. I came out of my first degree in agroecology with a similar sentiment to this question, but then when I went out to work and found myself working with government agencies and environmental nonprofit organizations, as well as industry partners, I realized that they didn't have the devil horns that I thought they would. Many resource management companies are supporting the front lines of stewardship and funding research, that makes stewardship of our lands and waters better. My work as an Indigenous ecologist makes it clear that our communities shaped our lands and waters since time immemorial to provide food, medicines, and technology. We did it then in ways that worked in harmony with our Earth Mother, and I believe that we can bring the old and new ways together to accomplish that. The Liberal government is directing government agencies to seek out Indigenous scholars to help create natural resource management policy that does just that. I just finished a contract myself for Fisheries and Oceans Canada. This is a huge win for ecological reconciliation, and I would push for more of that type of work and more direct supports for existing industries and the development of new industries supporting that work. I know that students want to use their education at home, and we need your knowledge of the places you live. You are the knowledge keepers yourselves, and I think that human ingenuity is a fundamental component of managing both mitigation and adaptation of climate change. We should have a tech sector here devoted to just that. We should have sophisticated habitat restoration programs, boots on the ground, and research that provide careers, not just jobs, right here at really ground zero of the climate crisis. The development of such programs has to happen from the ground up, which means someone inside the room in Ottawa, a member of the opposition, cannot make these things happen. Someone inside the room with my education and expertise means that these things can actually happen.
Thank you. Moving on to question 3. Building new houses seems to be the major plan for most housing policies during this election. New houses are not usually rented at affordable rates. How do you plan to create housing that will be available for students to rent at affordable rates? First, Rachel.
Well, this question is so important, and I hear about it all the time. My team sits on a lot of housing initiatives across the riding. It's a huge riding, so we have a lot of different places that we sit just to make sure that we're really keeping our fingers on the pulse of the issue. When I was first elected, I actually put forward my first private member's bill, and it was on the right to housing. And what it would do is literally add to the Bill of Rights the right to housing. And I remember on the day that we were going to vote on my bill, the minister came over and promised me that although he would not support my bill, that the housing strategy that they were putting forward, the Liberals, would include the right to housing. Well, it definitely included the right to housing in terms of language in the document, but it actually did not change fundamentally legislation. And so our commitment is to make sure that there is a right to housing and that we see investment in 500,000 units in the next 10 years that really focuses on affordability, making sure it's accessible for everyone and is based on a percentage of income rather than on a certain cost. Because we're seeing a lot of affordable housing that is built by the public sector, but as many of you know, is certainly not affordable for everyday people. We also are committed to having a $5,000, up to $5,000 a year in rental relief. We just know people need support. And as the cost increased so dramatically, we need to make sure it's as accessible as possible. These are really important. And of course, we really need to focus on the local communities and what's happening there. I know for this riding, we have 11 municipalities, over 20 Indigenous communities. The needs in each community are particular and unique. We want to make sure that the services and supports they get really reflect that. And I do want to say that the BC NDP have put a great big investment. I've sat in many announcements where I see millions of dollars from the provincial government with a couple $100,000 from the federal government. The federal government needs to pick up its game. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carla. You're next, please.
I'm sorry about the delays. Okay, first of all, housing is a human right and needs to be treated as such. The housing also needs to be human focused instead of profit focused. Right now, almost all housing is built for profit. That means they can't rent it at a rate which is affordable to most people who live in the area. We're not rich here. Although we have some government employers, there are not a lot of, there's nowhere near enough housing. We need to get profit out of housing the same way we need to get profit out of healthcare. With respect to affordability for students, I think on-campus housing is a great idea and could be promoted by the student union. In addition, you could have, there's also a model at Trent University in Ontario where there's some off-campus housing in the community, which worked very well when my sister went there 30 or 40 years ago. There are ways to house students affordably. We know all of this. All we need is the willpower to do it. The other thing that we need is a guaranteed livable income so that people can afford to pay their rent. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jennifer, please.
Well, this is an issue near and dear to my heart, as I have had students that have experienced homelessness, been couch surfing, and even living in their cars. I think that a major issue with each party is no one talks directly to students or those just entering the workforce. I hear parties talk about students extensively and often find their comments totally out of touch from what I hear, from the students that I teach. Not only are rents unaffordable, but there's no inventory for students or emerging professionals. While the Liberal government's national housing strategy is a multifaceted approach that's meant to make housing more affordable and address chronic homelessness, I would like to see a specific focus on housing for students and emerging professionals. Perhaps having a professor in the room in Ottawa can help provide a clear understanding of what the issues are and bring back solutions. Things like supporting academic institutions to build student housing units, and encouraging industry to invest in housing as part of their employment offerings. The Liberal government, in addition to its creation of Canada's national housing strategy and its commitments to relieve student debt, is serious about ensuring that there are careers for those coming out of school. Something that I think needs a greater focus here on the North Island Powell River riding. Too often rural ridings are overlooked as places for careers. So many parts of our riding should be hubs of innovation. Ensuring that there are thriving careers is something that the NDP does not acknowledge as an important piece of the solution to addressing both housing and the student debt issue. This is something I work with and talk to my students about the most. They come to me and say, I want to use this education so I can build the life I want and envision for myself. And we have to have the federal leadership motivated to ensure that those opportunities exist.
Wonderful. Jessica?
Thank you so much for this question. Obviously, housing comes up a lot in what we've been hearing from our constituents and at these debates. You're right. Just building new houses doesn't get the job done. It just increases the number of houses that are out of reach for most of us financially. We have to get a better handle on the market, and we need to invest in purpose-built rentals geared to income. For students especially, cooperative and co-housing options would be a great way for creating community and connection. We just can't trust the private market to address our needs. It only results in more inequality. We need to be able to choose who our landlords are, and it can be either us through our elected governments or wealthy investors. I'm actually really excited to talk about housing issues with this crowd in particular, because I know the best and most sustainable solution is to change the way we're thinking about housing and what the ideal is. We have a great opportunity here to shift the paradigm, to become more thoughtful communities and communities rather than just places where we live. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it is that we really do need each other, even if it's just to know that the world around us is there and we have some more support. I was in a listening event this weekend where we heard from someone who is creating an amazing nonprofit that is helping substance users go through treatment and not go back through the cycle of getting off treatment and going back onto the streets. They are they're building tiny homes for each other and for themselves. And it's part of the graduation process in this program. So we can be investing in more nonprofits like that who know what the problems are in their communities, and they've got innovative and interesting ways of addressing them. So I'm really excited by this. I think there's lots of room for opportunity and growth. And I know it's tough, but we do have ideas to fix that problem.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Next question. What will you do to create a BC where all people have access to affordable education? Carla, you're first. It looks like Carla is experiencing technical difficulties. We're going to move on and we can circle back to Carla. Jennifer, are you able to pick up?
Sure. When my students found out that I was running this election, many of them told me that they were voting Liberal this election because it was the Liberal government that made sure that they were not forgotten during the pandemic. And, that was when they lost things like their serving jobs, for example. The Canada Emergency Student Benefit was there for them. When their research was stopped, grants were extended as well. This is a government that values supporting educational opportunities for students without breaking the bank. Since 2015, our government has made the largest ever investment in young Canadians to respond to the pandemic, totaling $13.1 billion over 6 years, including action on student grants, loans, and training. Also, over 300,000 new work opportunities and experiences were created for young Canadians and provided income support for over 700,000 students, again, through that Canadian Emergency Student Benefit. Recently, our government doubled Canada student grants up to $6,000 for 2 years to support young people through the pandemic. And when we came into office in 2015, the max Canada student grant under the last Conservative government was only $1,500. So good luck paying for your books with that. I know firsthand the struggles my students face in affording their education, and humanizing myself as a professor and getting to know what is happening in their daily lives is important to me. And stress interrupts learning. That is scientific fact. We need to alleviate as many stressors as possible so that all of you can put your all into your learning as the next generation of problem solvers, and we need you. Moving forward, I support permanent Liberal government intentions of eliminating interest on student loans, raising the repayment assistance threshold to when a single person is able to earn more than $50,000 per year in their career, as well as letting new parents pause repayment of their federal student loans until their youngest child reaches the age of 5. This is a government that wants you to hit the ground running without the stress that comes with being saddled with student debt.
Wonderful. Thank you. Carla, let's see if we can get you up here right now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Carla.
Okay, thank you. First of all, we need to abolish tuition. 40 years ago, when I was in university, we marched on Queen's Park to abolish tuition fees. Instead, they kept going up and up and up, making it not only actually unaffordable, but also emotional and psychological barrier to higher education. Education should be free. Even to go to university is going to cost money. There's another question that was a little bit further down that had to do with interest on student loans. Our position is that there should be no student loans. There should be student grants. They should all be student grants. We did used to have grants when I was in university. I don't know if they still do. In addition to that, the guaranteed livable income would also help students be able to pay for their education. In addition, things like childcare are also important because we're not just dealing with young people here who may be single. There may be women returning to the workforce who need childcare, and hopefully that would be on-campus childcare. I know North Island College in Courtney has an on-campus childcare site. We need to look at education as something that's good for society and therefore to be valued and available to everyone.
Okay, we're stopping Carla at that. I'm going to move past Jessica as she's also having technical difficulties. We'll give her a second to settle. So Rachel, if you're prepared to answer this question, and we'll circle back to Jessica afterwards.
All the joys of the new technical world we live in. Thank you everyone for your patience. You know, for me, the cost of post-secondary education is really concerning to me because we know it's growing and growing. And my concern is we're going to get to a point, and we may already be there, where a lot of people can't even take that advantage. And I think it should be education that is accessible for all. I know for myself, when I went to university, my family didn't have a lot. My dad and stepdad both worked in the forestry industry, and it was falling apart and their work was not steady. And my mom and my stepmom were both doing the best that they could to support the family at home. So I had to work and use a lot of student loans to get through my education. And it took me many years to pay it off, especially with that interest on top of it. And when I think about my time starting a young family, at least housing was a lot more affordable. And right now we know that it is not. So for me, the NDP believes that we should remove interest from repaying student loans immediately, that we should increase the non-repayable Canadian student grants, in fact, double them. And we also need to make sure that tuition fees stay reasonable and as low as possible. Our goal in the long term is to make sure that post-secondary education is a system where you start in kindergarten and you go to where you want to get to so that you can benefit our communities and our country. And I think that's really important as we move forward. And I agree that affordability just for necessities also has to be addressed. So you talked earlier about having housing that was affordable and accessible for students. I think we need to see that investment. We need to make sure that childcare is important. The NDP has long had our platform that said $10 a day, and it's good to see the Liberals finally catching up and moving forward with that. And we also need to just make sure that it is as accessible as possible and that we are looking at affordability so that people can get to their greatest wishes. Education should be for absolutely everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. Jessica, it's your opportunity.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Rachel for stepping in for me while I was trying to sort out these last few things. Yeah, I was in post-secondary school for 9 years, and I understand how crushing student loan debt can be and how it impacts so many choices and opportunities that you have down the road. And unfortunately for me, what I'm about to say isn't going to help me. I'm still paying off my student loans, but it will help you. And I am so excited because this is an opportunity that will change lives. The Green Party would abolish all post-secondary education tuition, and we would cancel all federally held student loan debt. So this just opens up, like I said, so many opportunities and options down the road that you can move on with your life and use your education and enjoy it quicker. You don't have to worry about paying off those loans. We would also introduce the guaranteed livable income, which would help fill gaps along the way. And we would reintroduce a retroactive emergency student benefit to ensure that all those eligible for the $2,000 a month benefit, including international and recently graduated students, would receive it until the pandemic is over. It is hard enough being in school, and Jennifer, Dr. Grenz was talking about being a teacher. I've taught at community colleges myself, and I have heard some really heart-wrenching stories about how hard students are working to turn their lives around, working multiple jobs, being single moms, raising kids. It's tough, and I really honor and respect you so much, because it's not always the easy choice to do, to go to post-secondary school, but we do want to make that opportunity available for everyone. And we have a good plan and great ideas to make that happen.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jessica. Moving on to our next question, Jennifer is going to be the first. If you are a non-Indigenous person, what steps have you taken to educate yourself about how Indigenous peoples are experiencing life in Canada? And as an Indigenous person, how would you like to share Indigenous life in Canada?
Well, as an Indigenous person, quite obviously, I live it. My children live it. I think it's important to recognize that we cannot take pan-Indigenous approaches to our education about Indigenous people in what is now called Canada, just like the solutions to address the systemic racism and oppression within our systems of government cannot have templated approaches that treat our nations and communities as one in the same. I'd like to share with you the words of Chief Dan George of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, who said, "Can we talk of integration until there's integration of hearts and minds? Unless you have this, you have only a physical presence, and the walls between us are as high as the mountain range." This resonates for every facet of reconciliation. We can try, and we have made progress, but the progress feels slow because you have not known our real truth, our pain. And we're here, finally. The beginning of the recovery of our stolen children in Kamloops in May has shaken Canadians to their core, and I wish physical proof wasn't necessary, but I guess it was. This was the truth before reconciliation, and the walls between us are no longer as high as the mountain range. The Liberal Party of Canada is the party walking the talk on reconciliation. They are the only party that has and will govern that can continue this good work. Other parties can politicize us and try to claim reconciliation as theirs, but it's not. It's all talk, and it's not okay. The party in power is acting and will continue to act. I have many allies, friends, colleagues, and students, asking me what I can do. My answer to you is the same to them. Help put our voices inside the room of the party in power in Ottawa. Vote for me, even if this isn't normally the party that you vote for. Our children want our voices where they can truly make a difference for them and their family members that survived.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jessica, you are next.
Thank you. I am a non-Indigenous person, but I always look for new and different ways to educate myself, especially in this regard. So I read books, I take courses, I ask questions, I talk to people. I look for ways every place that I can. Random people on the ferry, I will strike up conversations with. I have done a few more formal things. A few years ago, I went with my husband and best friend to a sweat ceremony on Treaty 7 lands near Calgary, which was a profound and moving experience for so many different reasons. Last fall, I took the Indigenous Canada course through the University of Alberta, the one that Dan Levy promoted, and it barely scratched the surface, I know, but it scratched a lot of different facets of that surface and showed me how much I need to know and how much I learned what I don't know. And I know there are lots of things I don't know, but I'm always growing on it. As soon as I moved to Comox, I reached out to find ways that I could get involved in representing Indigenous people with Indigenous legal issues. And I got in touch with the Comox First Nations chief negotiator, and we're working on that. We're working on helping Comox move toward treaty together. And I look for different ways, and I love talking to people. My work is representing disenfranchised people, and I can't do that properly if I don't understand their story. I know I'm never going to understand it fully, but I need to understand where they're coming from at least. And I try every time that I can, every chance that I get, to learn more about the different stories.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Rachel?
Well, I am a non-Indigenous person, but I've had a unique experience in my life. When I was 2, my mom met the man who she would later marry and who would legally adopt me. He is from the Stalatin First Nation, which is up in the middle of British Columbia near Fraser Lake. And so growing up, I was the oldest of 5 children, and I actually learned a lot about what Indigenous people experience because I was treated differently than my family. And I can remember as a young person trying to understand what was happening. And it was years later that I finally understood that I was being treated differently because I was very pale, blue-eyed and blonde, and the rest of my family was not. I can remember situations where I was with my dad where strangers would say to me, where's your parents? And I was with my dad, but the assumption was I didn't belong to him. I went away to university and I chose to get a double major in First Nation Studies and Women's Studies. And it was actually at that point when I was learning about the history of Canada that I really started to understand about residential school. And I remember calling home and saying, well, did anyone go to residential school? I've never heard of this before. And that's where I started to learn about my granny who went to Lejac Residential School from the time she was 4 until she was 16. And it was one of those moments where I started to have conversations with my family and just recognize that, it wasn't really that they were hiding it. It was just that it was so painful to talk about. And even as we found the lost children and we continue to find, I know we're over 6,000 children across this country that we found, I find talking to my family this mosaic of pain where one auntie or one uncle knows this story and doesn't know this other story, and it's like we're weaving together the history of my granny through this process, and it's a painful thing to do. So I think for me, I've just had this unique experience and I just love my family and I'm honored that they claim me as theirs.
Wonderful. Thank you. Carla?
Okay. I guess my first real exposure to any kind of Indigenous culture was the poems of Pauline Johnson in Southern Ontario. Next would have been when I lived in Saskatchewan, and the word I won't use the words that they used to describe Indigenous people, but they were horrifying. A lot of people now have heard of the stories of the nightmares of Indigenous children in Saskatoon being picked up and dropped out in the middle of nowhere in the middle of winter. I was extremely upset by that. And I was even more upset when my mother told me the same thing had been happening when she was growing up in Saskatchewan. The second exposure was when I was working in Prince Rupert as a lawyer. And one of the jobs I had was acting for the parents of children who got their children taken away by the states. And most of them, almost all of them, were Indigenous, and almost all of my Indigenous clients were children of residential school survivors. I learned a lot about the history of residential schools, the history of survivors, and the truth about the history of the settlers destroying an entire civilization. It was horrifying to me. When I learned of the Indigenous graves in Kamloops, I wasn't surprised. I wasn't shocked. I knew they were there because I had always heard they were there. I always heard all these stories, and
Okay, Carla, I'm sorry, that was 2 minutes. That's that question. We're going to move on. It's kind of part B to this question, though. What is your first concrete step in moving towards truth and reconciliation? And Jessica, we're going to start with you.
Thanks, and thanks for the question. First, I think that we need to acknowledge that we're still in the truth part of truth and reconciliation. We are still literally digging up the truth. And I am so heartbroken for the families and the people who are torn apart, intentionally having their spirits and their bodies broken. And as a mother, I can think of nothing worse. And I know the other mothers on this call and those of you who are listening can feel the same way. Rachel just said, we're up to 6,000 bodies now. And we still have, separate from that, missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, guys, two-spirited people. We need to be fully funding searches led with Indigenous guidance and tradition of all the residential schools, and fund the work to identify the families to whom these remains belong and ensure that they are respectfully and humbly returned to their homes. And then we need to get to work on holding the people who did this to account. And that means pressing criminal charges when the people are still alive to receive them, and holding the organizations that allowed this to happen, who knew this to happen, who facilitated these things in happening, to account. I have filed civil lawsuits before against the Catholic Church for historic sexual abuse. I know what we're up against. I know that the Vatican is a big opponent to have, but horrible things were happening, and many of us did not know about it and are horrified. Like Jennifer said, we were shaken to our core, and we need to be doing the work to hold these organizations to account and helping people find justice.
Thank you. Rachel?
Well, I think this is a question that all of us as non-Indigenous people just have to keep asking ourselves, is what are we doing every single day in terms of reconciliation and acknowledging the truth of the history of Canada and the truth of today and what's happening today, because colonialism is not over. It's not over. And I think that we have to find ways to carry that within ourselves. I like to say to people that if you are non-Indigenous and you're not uncomfortable at least half of the time, then you're probably not pushing yourself enough. And I would encourage you to be uncomfortable even more than that. I fundamentally believe that the core of reconciliation, there must be justice and truth. Until those voices are acknowledged and heard and justice is brought, we can't see the next steps happening. And I think about the burden that Indigenous people have to carry. So an example that I can give specifically is when my son, who's also Indigenous, was in school. You know, he was in grade 5 and he went to library. The kids all sat down and the librarian showed them a picture of children in residential school. She did not describe what that was, just showed them the picture and asked the kids to say, what do you think about this picture? And so kids were saying things like, oh, they look really sad. Maybe they didn't get their hot lunch today. Maybe they were planning to go on a trip and they couldn't go anymore. Something happened to the bus. And my son, when he came home after that day, he just said, I sat in that room and I could just feel the pressure in me. Because nobody knew that these were the kids that went to residential school. And my spouse has gone to residential school. So it was a big part of my son's identity of being the first generation in his family to not go to residential school. And so finally, Kai just said, well, maybe these are kids that have been taken from their families and they're in residential school and they just want to go home. And that's why they're sad. So when I think about this, we must understand that if we don't acknowledge it, if we don't learn ourselves, then we are putting the burden on those communities who don't need to carry it anymore.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Oh, sorry. I thought I was after Carla in the order here. Have we switched it, I guess? Oh.
Sorry, my crib notes had you after.
Yeah, I next in the order.
Yeah, you switched it after she lost touch. Yeah.
Yes, I apologize. So I didn't update my crib notes after that point. So I apologize.
Okay, so who's going? Sorry.
Okay, so I'm going next then?
Okay.
Sure.
I'm going, right?
Yeah, carry on. Thank you.
Okay. Well, reconciliation begins with respect and listening. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a good place to start, but the recommendations need to be implemented with the consent of each First Nation where these things are being implemented. We can't, as the settler class, just assume that we know what's best and say, this is how we're going to implement them. It's not up to us how it's implemented. That's a very paternalistic attitude. We assumed that we knew what was best when we began the residential schools, when we actively sought to destroy an entire civilization, multiple civilizations. It's up to us to ask them what they want and then help them to do it. We can't lead on an Indigenous issue. It's not our right. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jennifer?
The Liberal Party of Canada has made many, many steps forward with truth and reconciliation, and they have done the hard work of investing in relationship building with Indigenous nations, working to repair very deep wounds, legacies of governments that didn't believe in the rights and value of Indigenous peoples. And healing takes time. Healing work together isn't the fancy stuff that, governments can promote, nor should they be bragging about it. It's an investment in being able to move forward. And the Liberal government understood that. And they have taken the time to do that, and it shows. There are many dimensions to reconciliation, as colonialism is woven through just about every part of the government. This is why the Liberal government has worked to identify this and put people like me into policy positions within my area of expertise, natural resource management and Indigenous ecology, to help create solutions. There are more Indigenous people like me across the front lines of reconciliation working in this government. It is easy to forget or be critical of what the Liberal government has done to move forward on truth and reconciliation. May I remind you that this is the government that introduced Bill C-15 to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, initiated the investigation into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, has 80% of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action completed or well underway, and has invested over $4 billion in water infrastructure projects, including 99 new water plants, 109 long-term water advisories lifted, and 8 more just announced. I am an Indigenous candidate running for this party because I know that they walk the talk for our people, and they want people like me in the room, bringing my knowledge and expertise to continue to bring healing between our nations so that our people can thrive and have the justice that they deserve.
Awesome. Thank you so much. How do you plan to improve access to all levels of education for Indigenous people? Rachel, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you for this very important question. And the reality is the Indigenous population is the fastest growing population in Canada, and yet we see consistently that both Conservative and Liberal governments do not increase the funding for education the way that they should, especially to reflect that kind of growth. So our commitment, of course, is to see that investment increase. I also think that we have to look at key issues like clean drinking water. We know that there are many communities across this country that still don't have that basic human right of clean drinking water. In some cases, they have waited well over 20 years. I've talked to people who've lived their whole lives in a community on reserve where they've never had access to turn on their tap and drink their water. And I agree that there has been some work done by the Liberals, but there's still so much yet to do. The other thing that we have to look at is the trauma and impacts that we still see. So, for example, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, who has said to this government that, the First Nations children on reserve have been underfunded for care. And that means that their outcomes in life can be more challenging. I've talked to some of these people. They've been in committee to come talk to us about the impacts of foster care on reserve, less funded than any other place across Canada. So we need to see those things remedied. And right now, that is not the case. The Liberals are, in fact, in court with Indigenous children right now. And I think that it's absolutely appalling that they're debating how much a childhood should cost. You know, these are things where I look to Cindy Blackstock to lead us. And I figure that that woman has done so much tremendous work. We should be listening to her on this. So as we look at education, we have to make sure that there's access to appropriate services, economic justice, which is a subject that I could get into so many ways that the different policies of this government and the previous governments continue to deny Indigenous community the ability to build up their economic strength. All of these things need to be addressed if we want to get to that key part of education.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Carla? You're muted, Carla.
Am I unmuted now?
That's correct. Carry on.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Indigenous education, access for Indigenous people to education means more than simply funding it or, letting them come. Education in Indigenous communities undoubtedly has negative connotations because of the residential school systems. The current educational system does not take into account cultures beyond the settler culture. When I was in law school in the mid-'80s, there was a fellow student of mine who was Indigenous, and he was, there was no Indigenous law program at the time, there is now. And he really felt it was necessary for there to be programs that were aimed at people who didn't fit into the normal educational stream that a lot of us here might. There's a larger fallout from residential schools, which is that people have been afraid to go to schools, advanced education, because of them.
3, 2, 1. Sorry, Carla. We'll have to move on. Jennifer, please.
Well, improving access to education for Indigenous peoples is the very reason why I continue to work at the University of British Columbia. Our presence matters. Not only do we help blaze the trail for students coming behind us, I had many and still have many hurdles to overcome within such a colonial institution. But someone like me being there provides students the mentorship and support where they know that they are understood, and it helps them to feel like they belong, even though it often feels like you're putting a square peg in a round hole. My presence also helps to shape the next generation of scientists, teachers, and doctors that will have a decolonized understanding of science and experience the application of an Indigenous worldview and seeing what the potential that has for their own work. When I hear how undergrads talk to and work with our Indigenous students, I have so much hope for the future. Our children are getting an incredible start to their education. The 2018 co-developed Canada's Indigenous Early Learning and Childcare Framework has resulted in education designed for our kids by Indigenous educators and knowledge keepers. We have education that embraces our cultures, our languages, our ways of knowing and seeing. Every time I watch my little cousins sing our songs in school, my heart bursts. Our grandmothers could never have imagined this. The Liberal government has built and refurbished almost 200 schools. It is committed to fully funding the Jordan's Principle that makes sure that our First Nations children living in Canada can access what they need to support the whole child, what a child needs to thrive. Funding targeted at a wide range of health, social, and educational needs, such as tending to the needs of First Nations Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA children and youth and those with disabilities. The future is bright for our young people, and we need to keep heading that direction.
Thank you. Jessica?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for this question. So on direct point, one of the things that the Greens would do is remove the 2% cap in education funding for Indigenous students to ensure that Indigenous youth have access to post-secondary education. And for earlier education and secondary education, we would work in consultation with the traditional governments and elected governments of the First Nations to ensure that we are meeting the needs and providing a quality education for all First Nations, Métis Nations, and Inuit kids who are entitled to, as a human right, a quality education. But just touching on a couple of the other things that some of the other speakers have said, you can have access to a world-class education, and if you do not have clean drinking water, if you are away from your parents because you're in foster care, and we know that Indigenous kids are overrepresented in the foster care system. If you've got a parent who's in prison or in jail, and we know that Indigenous people are overrepresented in those systems as well, you do not have the support that you need to succeed. So addressing education is not just looking at education by itself, it's looking at the whole system and the opportunities that are available. It's about having enough resources to make an education meaningful and be able to enjoy it and have food in your tummy when you're in class and you're not embarrassed about not having food, or you can't focus because you're hungry, or you don't know when your parent is coming home or your brother or sister is missing. All of these things make education really hard. So we need to be looking at this as a holistic problem and not something that can be solved with an education band-aid.
Thank you very much. In light of our earlier technical difficulties, we're not going to be able to make it to our last question. So I'm going to ask candidates to move forward into our closing statements. We're going to go in the order of Jennifer, Jessica, Rachel, and then Carla. So Jennifer, you have 2 minutes as your closing statement.
Thanks. And thanks again for having us this evening. I think it's important that we recognize the difference between the power that we carry in our advocacy and the power that we carry in our vote. So often, us progressive voters that care deeply about climate, our lands and waters, caring for all people, end up voting for the parties that are not in power in Ottawa because they present policies that may be considered on the furthest end of the spectrum of progress. And that resonates with us. I've done it too. There is an important role for advocacy. I've worked in environmental advocacy for a lot of my career, but I've also learned that through my work on the environment, on climate, on reconciliation, that when we vote that way, when we vote in ways aligned directly with our advocacy, we can actually hurt our causes. Sometimes it creates a path for the Conservatives. Other times it has given us less power as we're in a minority government. For this riding, it means that the original ideas that we need to have thriving and resilient communities may have a less chance of happening. The incumbent is outside the room, and I wish politics didn't work that way, but they do right now. And I just want to remind you that the Liberal Party is the party that has raised 278,000 kids out of poverty, has legalized marijuana, put a price on pollution, doesn't forget the youth in this country and empowers women, walks the talk on reconciliation, and is the party with a climate plan that even former leader of the BC Greens says is the best. I am on the front lines of ecological reconciliation. I am a teacher of students like you. I know that as allies, you think it important to have an Indigenous scholar represent you in Ottawa. If there are things you don't like, if you think the Liberals don't go far enough on the things that you care about, I can get those messages heard. I was on a call today with the Prime Minister himself. Indigenous voices get heard. My students gave me a 4.89 out of 5 in my teaching assessment, one of the highest marks by a long shot in my faculty for how I communicate. I think I'll take that as an endorsement from my amazing students that I get to teach as someone well positioned to communicate difficult things at the table of an Ottawa and get the results that we need in this riding.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Jessica?
Thank you, Carissa. I would just like to thank Rachel for her service as our MP for these past 2 terms. And she has showed us that you do not have to be in the majority to have an impact. The climate crisis is the existential crisis of our time, and you have just been asked to not vote for how you feel. That is wrong. Vote for what you feel. Vote for the party who aligns best with you. And if that's not me, that's okay. But you should be able to sleep at the end of your days and know that you put the X next to the name who stood for you and for what you believed in, and not for a voice that was going to try to talk to the Prime Minister if she could, and hopefully he would hear what she had to say. Listen, when I was in university, I had no idea what I was doing. I was going to major in human biology, and then I was going to major in music, and I ended up majoring in German and psychology, and then I just kept going in psychology, and then I switched to law school, and now I'm a human rights lawyer. A lot of the choices that you are making right now, you don't know where you're going to end up. You don't know how they're going to impact your life or where they're going to take you. But the choice that you're about to make, if you haven't made it yet, if you're going to make it with your mail-in ballot or on Monday, matters. And you know where this choice is going to take you. The Liberal climate plan isn't good enough. It's shooting for the middle of the road, and that's not where we need to be. This is a crisis, and we need to pull all the stops to make it happen. You need to know that I am running because I am terrified for my children. I am terrified for the young kids and what is being left. And the Liberals have had their chance. They have had a chance to do something about it, and they haven't done anything. And the NDP isn't any better. They haven't stood up to the Liberals and asked them for anything on the climate. We need your voices, and we need you to vote the way that you want to vote. Don't let somebody take your choice away from you. It is only your choice to make. It is not somebody's right to tell you who not to vote for because they want your vote. Vote for who fits with you, who makes you proud.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Rachel?
Well, thank you all of you for being here tonight. And of course, thank you to all the folks that helped moderate today. I really appreciate the work that you've done in organizing this. It's been a great honor to serve as your member of parliament for the last 6 years. And one of the elders that's really important in my life, Alberta Billy, always said to me, "You do it because you must." And I think of all the times in this work that I've done over the last 6 years where I have traveled across the riding, talked to people from different groups, really tried to make sure that in everything that I do, the voice of this region is heard in the House of Commons. And when it gets really hard and I'm tired of flying back and forth all the time and living in between 2 time zones, or when I'm here during COVID time, waking up at 5 o'clock, 4:30 in the morning because Ottawa's starting already at that time and I need to be part of that process, I just carry her words of wisdom. I'm an advocate. My background is all in the nonprofit sector. I've always chosen work that means I'm on the ground listening to people and making sure those voices are heard. I'm a passionate advocate, a fighter. And I have to tell you, the ministers in that place know who I am. They know the issues in our riding because I make sure that they know it. And I work across party boundaries with people who have a vision that is similar to mine. I really believe in the collaborative approach, and I believe that when you all share the stories of your riding, where you find those connections, you can make a difference. So if it's in the way that I've pushed forward legislation, if it's in the way that I've been able to modify legislation, and in the last, almost 2 years, worked very closely with the government to make changes and push them to do so much better. If it wasn't for the NDP, we would not have seen some of the money that came out for students, that came out for seniors, that came out for veterans. These are things that I'm incredibly proud of. And as an opposition member, I was able to fight and make things happen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. Carla?
Hello. First of all, thank you to the North Island College Students Union and the moderators. Although we had some technical difficulties, you sorted it out fairly quickly, so thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that the website for the Marxist-Leninist Party is cpcml.ca if you want to find out more information about our party. The voting age should be reduced to 16. That's something we haven't mentioned yet, but I think is important to students. I would have liked to vote at 16. And what we need to vote for is an anti-war government. Right now, our war machine is fully integrated with the American industrial complex. What do they call it? The military industrial complex. We were warned against it. Right now, people have no voice in our foreign policy. It's entirely dictated by the United States. That's why we need a government elected by the people. The system should be funded, not the parties, and parties should not come to power. People should come to power. The candidates should be elected, should be selected by the people and not the parties, and should be beholden to nobody but the people for their votes. The UN Charter commits us to non-interference. We should get out of both NATO and NORAD, and we should oppose the embargo on Cuba by the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you so much to the candidates for stepping forward into this hugely important role of leadership. We're wishing you and yours the very best as we get closer and closer to September 20th. Thank you to everyone who attended tonight. Your engagement in your riding is important. We hope tonight's conversations will help inform your decision-making. Remember, advance polls are open even tonight until 9 p.m. Visit Elections Canada in your community. Visit the Campbell River Commons Shopping Mall, Pioneer Mall in Port McNeill, or the Town Centre Mall in Powell River. Friends who vote together stay together, so make voting a team effort this year. And thank you to everybody who's here tonight.